maybe we start with this. So we've covered a lot of thoughts, and I really hope, again, tonight that there's questions that people want to ask and we can go through them. I'm going to try and keep my answers a little bit shorter tonight. But if I can just do this quick intro first tonight. One of the hardest things to get your head around when people start talking about law or words of law or structures of law is that for most of us, it's incredibly intimidating, as it is for people, by the way, who have gone through and done law. Even ask a barrister. It's that if they've had enough drinks, they'll tell you that they've only scratched the surface of the system. I don't know what the standing number of laws are in the UK at the moment, but I think the standing number is probably close to, if you break them down into regulations, like you can't do this, you can't, you can have a TV, break them down to not the documents, but actual rules. I think in the UK, we're living under something, well, you're living under something like 40 or 50 million rules, at least. 40, 50 million.
Wow. Yes.
Seriously. That's right. The most the Romans ever had was about, I think, 200, 300 on the 12 tablets in the Forum. Nebuchadnezzar had, I think, a couple hundred there in Babylon. 40 million. Yeah? Rules. Now, people say, yes, but you're including specialised and doctors and scientists and fields where, frankly, those things don't affect people, but they do. They affect doctors, and if they affect doctors, they affect you. Or if they affect butchers, they ultimately indirectly affect you, or financial companies or blockchain. Lots of laws affect finance. There's thousands, tens of thousands of laws about finance. Trust me, if any of you have gone and tried to set up a business and discovered how many rules there are with different agencies. I think in America they're up to 80, 100 million standing laws between the federal, the state and the local. No one can follow those. I've read the statutes of Westminster. I have done that. I did that because I wanted to understand for myself whether there was any logical reason in what was created. And I have to say it sent me mad a good half a dozen or a dozen times reading it. And I can confirm, having read the statutes, that it's absolute, anything prior to 1834 is horrendous fraud or it is absolute insanity. It's the people that wrote this must have been on opium. Absolute insanity. Evil, conniving insanity. So the challenge is, when we talk about bylaws or how do we apply this or how do we deal with overreach of regulation or how do we deal with new financial products or how do we deal with a changing market, how do we deal with transforming our community into being more responsive, to being more independent, we've got to start with something that gives us a baseline. Otherwise people are going to say, well, it's too hard. I'm going to defer to people who are quote unquote experts on this. They'll tell me what to do, better or worse. But then if you never know and you're putting your faith in that, how do you know? So 2 weeks ago, I gave you a document that is the introduction to the revised positive law that's been worked on for years, that I do believe, from what I've had feedback, that if you read it, if you take the time to read it, 50 pages, at the end of that, you should know the difference between what is law and what is not. And if you've got that baseline, then we can build from that. We can talk about bylaws. We can talk about how persons are created. We can talk about how financial products work and how money actually works and how all these things actually should work and can work and will work. But we've got to start with that baseline. So, Ramsey, is it worth getting people's feedback to see what they've felt and what they've read if people have read in here and just get their first impressions?
Sure, yes. if you go to the Decoding Law channel, the link is shared there for you. If you don't have it in front of you, the source material to what Frank is referring to for positive law, you can find it there. If this is being recorded, and the resource will be shared below. If anyone's got any feedback on that, please share in the Decoding Law channel.
Or you can just ping out. Are we recording tonight, by the way? I didn't ask actually for recording.
Frank has arrived and he's put the recorder on.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic.
Yep, so it's being recorded now. And the event was set up last week, and the title of it is called Decoding Law, Bylaws for Minimum Viable Sovereign Societies.
We're definitely going to tackle that. We're going to definitely tackle that tonight. But I do feel that before we do, there needs to be a baseline for all of us to be confident that as we learn, we're on solid ground and not on shifting sands. Do you want to kick it off, Ramsey, and then we see if people want to chip in? Because I really think it's important that if people don't get what we've said or you don't agree, I'm happy whatever people want to say. But before we get to bylaws, I think, and correct me if people disagree, before we go too much into this.
Consider it kicked off. Consider it, this is you introduced it, consider it kicked off. I mean, we're here to explore more about that, and as you say, the baseline is required to establish some groundwork. And if anyone has any questions, you know where to put them in the Decoding Law channel. If someone wants to ask a question in audio, please do. Video, please do. And be great to get kicked off to kick off with that. Your intro, Frank, was great. So if you want to carry on with that, that would be fantastic.
Well, yeah. Look, it's. I'm going
to say something.
Yeah. Look, please fire away.
Unmuted. Rich.
Yeah. I have a sorry. Apologies as well, Frank, for the last. I haven't been able to attend for the last 2 weeks, and I'm trying to catch up on a load of stuff. I haven't read all of it. I've read half of it. I mean, it's obviously all these things. It's like a lot of this stuff is not really suited to a very quick response. Quite a lot of this stuff you need to sit with and consider quite deeply, just to even figure out how to frame the question to respond to. But I'm going to have a go. I think my starting point when you ask about the definitions in positive law, my main question really roots around 8, which is ultimately the sort of religious connections and the kind of the establishment of, or the credibility. I'm not sure what the right word is, but let's just say the credibility of these definitions and how they then equate to the various different religious divinations that are listed here. So there's 3, which is Islam, Christianity, and then the third one, which I'm guessing is sort of Buddhism, or is it Buddhism? Like Dharma?
Well, it's an amalgam, so it's indigenous and it's others.
Yeah, and so I guess, and like the question I have, and I'm going to stumble over phrasing the question because I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it. Like, so the in order for this to be okay, let's just maybe this is the way to explain it. So say we have 3 people in our community. Well, let's say there are 4 people in our community. One person is a Christian, one person is Muslim, one person is an indigenous tribe. We actually have an indigenous tribe potentially in the community. So what is the sort of step to make this credible? Like, who do they I'm just trying to work out the interface here. Who do they go to? Like, what is the sort of like the mechanism here where you go, okay, we have this rewriting or this reframing of positive law through the context of existing law as people as understood through this document. So, like, if we then go to a point where there is a sort of right, we have a certain number of bylaws and like even a very simple agreement, and the jurisdiction in which this is governed or the laws are established is effectively the jurisdiction we're talking about establishing here. What, like, if I went to an existing contract, it would be, well, like the government, the contract set out here, the law that governs this agreement is England and Wales. Like, how does that, like, just very basic thing? How does that link work? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, there's a few points you raised. So credibility, law,
Yeah.
the question of religion and law. So let me ask that. So there's a few parts to it. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's start with what I was opening with, and that was the opening section to positive law, which is introductory definitions, that defines or claims to define what are civilized rules and what are uncivilized rules. And it doesn't quote legal texts and it doesn't quote previous scholars, but what it does do is it refers to what is considered in any measure of law common understandings. So common understandings are things like the right to a defence, the right to be tried by a jury, innocence until proven guilty, and it deals with simple concepts that most people by a certain age are at least familiar or could be familiar with or see are common, and then tries to show the difference between a baseline of those compared to a comparison of egregious and immoral and corrupt and, frankly, moribund behaviour. So that section tries to do that. But the questions you've asked start with religion and law, and I know that this is one that is a difficult one to get your head around, but it actually comes back to a very simple 3-word statement, or 4 actually. All law is moral. All law is moral. And that has stood the test of time up until the end of the 19th century and the 20th century, where it was removed from people's common understanding. By the end of the 20th century, a lot of people wouldn't even think that all law is moral. They would see law as something that is part of society. It's based on consensus. It's based on all these kind of systems, and it has nothing to do with religion. Because morality, even morality, has been framed by the media framers in a certain way as being old school and old hat and old thing. And of course, the consequence of that degradation of appreciation of just the most fundamental thing, a law, and we say it in the very first beginning of it, to break it down to what is a rule. A rule is essentially a permission or prohibition to perform or do some act. It's no more complicated than that. That's what a rule is. And in essence, that being a rule, all law is moral. And the highest morality since the beginning of time has been the morality of our religious leadership. So, Richard, that's the connection to religion, and only that nexus that brings us to the modern principle that hopefully people get, that all law is moral. And if it's not moral, it can't be law. Do you see that part?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, by the way, like all of this is there's a very sort of rigid, or very not rigid is the wrong word. There's a very clear scaffolding that you've obviously built up over a long period of time, and so I think that's like seeing the sort of very thin outlines of certain pieces. It does make you question or ask questions about certain things, and so
Sure.
I absolutely get that kind of like that 4-word explanation. But I guess like all these things, it then like the question that is the question after that is whose morals are we talking about, which is obviously the different
Well, the
religious
society.
doctrine.
Well, no, it's not. No,
No,
it's not. No. I think, look, by recognizing that all law is moral, and what is morality? Morality is just the collective consensus of the community that agrees to adhere to that model of law. That's all that morality is. That's all it is.
yeah,
And all it should ever be. Yeah? We're about to talk about bylaws later on tonight, and it's a great intro, Richard, to talk about these things. Yeah. But if the problem with law, of which there are many, but the problem with law is that we lost our way from the very beginning. They intentionally took us away from the very essence to allow us to live in a world where we essentially agree to the most absurd things, most notably to live effectively as batteries for a system that lives off our energy. It's the most extraordinary thing to watch. It's like mass hypnosis. How did millions and millions and millions of people around the world collectively agree to be the battery farms in the Matrix? Willingly. It's
one thing on
because,
that. One thing on that, Frank.
yeah.
Just because I think that like the any comparison is obviously helpful here, right? Like so that if we say that the system has evolved in a particular way to create, as you say, like we're the batteries in the matrix, like the counter to like I guess the question we're asking throughout all of this is there another way? And so in your experience, are there examples out there where that path or that evolutionary path that was established and moved forward in the Western world primarily over the last however many thousand years, does that exist? And I'm speaking sort of, this is a slightly leading question because we have conversations ongoing with this Amazonian tribe, and so I'm just thinking at the back of my mind, part of the reason they're coming over to want to talk to Western leaders, to religious leaders, to like various people in different communities outside of their kind of tribe, is that they still live with and govern by and work within natural constraints where they don't have the kind of the legal frameworks that we're working to, and I don't know whether it's good or bad, but like their version of morality or their version of societal kind of and their organizational structures are necessarily sort of more ancient and primal. So I'm just wondering whether that's a useful comparison to just sort of compare and contrast.
It is because, I mean, and I've mentioned to you that within the body of work of Ucadia, we have such things as Yapa in the restoration of Indigenous law in Australia. We have Tara in the restoration of Indigenous law of the Celts, Five Worlds, Waiata. We have a number of texts that go to the very premise of ancient systems of society and social strata and structure. But again, I want to be mindful that I just want to focus on the first principles, because if the first principles are wrong, like if the question is wrong, how can the answer be right? If the first principles are not understood, then you can ask a million questions, you can kiss a million frogs and get no closer to the answer. Is that a reasonable presumption, or do you not feel?
My only very quick response to that is if we had the Amazonian tribe in front of us, and you were doing this same process with them, do you think there is a path in your experience that you would get to the same first principles that they would?
Yes. Yes, because I've studied enough to appreciate and respect that I would never presume to know their law. That would be an overstretch, and that would be culturally insulting. But I do know enough of Indigenous law to be able to frame a conversation, to find similarity and comparison, and to demonstrate that many of the fundamentals of their system align to the same fundamentals of civilized rules of law in the first 50 pages I gave you of positive law some weeks ago, which is a self-evident and self-confirming document. And back to that original question of credibility. Look, credibility in this world is a weapon. And, I stopped worrying about credibility years ago for that reason. It's an unwinnable argument. If you want to win it, then you go and get people who meet the message, and you massage the message, and you're into messaging and placeholdering and positioning rather than substance building. And Ucadia's never been about that. And so I've stayed away from credibility, because credibility in an academic world is citation and peer review and building upon. And I respect that. I've got academics in the family. I respect it enormously. But again, if the pillars are broken and are decaying, credibility is. There's another way to view something, and that is, have I read something that gives me a useful framework? And I like the word framework because I think it applies to anything. It certainly applies in software. Have I read a useful framework that gives me a starting point to go out and inquire, not just about Ucadia, but about other ideas? Is it giving me a tool set, something useful to go from? And that's what I thought, and I hoped, and I trust the first 50 pages of Positive Law give you, a beginning of a framework, a good one, to start answering these questions, whether it be Indigenous tribal leaders. In fact, the 50 pages is an excellent framework to find common ground. Excellent.
That's great. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, and so just a couple of things, Richard. I really love it. I think what I love about the questions you ask is it goes to the crux of it, and they're questions, they're important questions. A couple of things that I didn't answer because there were multiple parts that I wanted to quickly cover. Morality as a social consensus within a community is so important as the bedrock of that community forming clear and cohesive law. But and I think why that's important is it elevates the laws beyond just mechanistic to realise that the culture of that community, the ethos of that community, that the reason that community has a point of difference, a voice compared to others, is actually born out of that understanding that morality is not owned by, constrained by, or patented to established religions. It is absolutely something that is born out of a group of people saying, you know what, we do see we have common threads, we have common ideas, we have common sense of decency, and we want to build a set of laws for our community that don't just simply deal with the nuts and bolts and members and, sanctioning members that do the wrong thing and what happens when we divvy up and how we vote and all that. That's all mechanistic. But the underlying morality, the social consensus of that community. So I think it's really important, Richard. I'm glad you raised it. And I hope tonight that when you do read this, there has to, with Ucadia, there has to be a distinction. There needs to be a distinction that the morality we're talking about tonight about bylaws is about what you as a group or any group sees as the social consensus, the purpose of being, the reason you're coming together beyond just the nuts and bolts. So I thought that was an important point to cover off, Richard. All right. Well, I'm really. Are there any other questions anyone has on the beginning of the baseline before we talk about bylaws towards and what's meant by them and how they're built and how to do them, how not to do them? I'm in your hands. Does anyone else want to cover the notes for the last few weeks or any questions? I'm open to any questions before we start that. Ramsey?
Hi, Frank. Yeah. Any questions from anyone? Yeah, please share them in the Decoding Law channel.
Hey, Frank, I got a bit of a question. I don't know if it might be a little bit off topic, but if you're willing to field one, then.
Sure.
So have you been following what's happening in the US with abortion law?
Yep.
And what do you think is behind this? And do you think this is creation of batteries and cattle? Or do you think this is moral? And I'd just be interested to hear your take on it all.
Well, sure. Well, you know that there's in America more than probably anywhere else. There's two groups that are diametrically opposed, completely opposed, and they've been at war for more than 50 years. Yeah. And there's one group that firmly believes that once a woman becomes pregnant, that's it. Once they're in the mode of conception, that's it. There's no ifs or buts. That baby has to be brought to full term. Yeah, in complete contradiction to what we see in nature, in any other species, in any other reasonable situation, of which there are many cases that a pregnancy is terminated in nature, whether it be drought, famine, danger, all kinds of things, you know. And then the other group that says, well, we don't just want the choice to terminate a pregnancy within 55 days or 2 months. You know, we want the right to essentially terminate a pregnancy right up to the day. It's our body. We can do what the hell we want. And no, the fetus has got no rights at all. And we're the mother. And so you can all, take a hike. That's the opposing views. I'm not making a judgment on either of those views, but they're the two diametrically opposing groups. Have I summarised it in a reasonable way, do you feel, as to the opposites?
Yeah, but I'm more talking about the economic point from it.
Well, the economics is interesting because Planned Parenthood 2 years ago, it was my understanding that they're generating revenue somewhere in the order of 200 to 300 million US per annum as an organisation, which is pretty substantive. Yeah, that's a lot of money, and that half the money. And please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not. I do not have their annual report in front of me, so if I make positions, I may be wrong. But a good portion of the money, I'll say it that way, a good portion of their revenue was in the on sale of the genetic material gathered from the process of terminations. Right? So there's a lot of economic incentive of that respect. which to me is troubling at best. It's like the private ownership of prisons and the commercialisation of law in America, where there's millions of people rotating through that system, which is, again, terribly troubling, the way that that's gone. So I see the economics, but I don't think it's really about economics. I think it's back to that two groups that have entrenched themselves in positions that I outlined to start with. What's your feeling on that? Yeah?
No, I was just interested to hear your take on it all.
I think so long as two groups have views so diametrically opposed as they do, and neither of those views are what I was trying to get to is, if you look at those views, are either of those views scientific? I
was more looking at it like neither of them are repugnant.
Are you sure about that? Are you sure that terminating a baby a day before it's born is not repugnant?
Well, maybe a day before it's born, but
sure. There are laws that Virginia passed a law that effectively gave that right. And then there are other views in states where the moment you're pregnant, the instant you're pregnant, they say that baby has rights and the mother has no rights to terminate. You sure that's not repugnant?
Well, it just gets me thinking like Bill and Melinda Gates. They were going around handing out contraceptives and that sort of thing to like third world nations so that these people weren't born into slavery. And like I got to watching a bunch of your sort of YouTubes and just thought maybe, we needed some more population.
Well, yeah, what I'm getting at is if two groups are staunchly unwilling to approach this with any reason, any logic, then at the end of the day, it's virtually impossible to see any type of resolution or calmer waters anytime soon in America, is there?
Well, these laws are passed. Powers that be have put them in, and now there's going to be more babies going around.
And there's going to be more.
Is it worth us, like, just before we get sidetracked too far? Like, I think the key thing about these conversations is that, like, it's a useful exercise to talk about external like things that are going on in the real world, or like in the world as we understand it. But right now we're sort of trying to go back to the first principles of our community and how law is formed to ultimately inform how we like establish something very, very basic in its sort of minimum viable product. Like for us, like we're like in 1,000 years we can sort of check back and see how we've done as a community. But right now I think it's maybe worth kind of focusing on.
Well, let's move on to that. Well, happy to do that.
Well. If I can make a comment as well, and I'd just like to apologise as well if I'm not overly sharing too much today, because I got a migraine day. But nonetheless, Rich, you make a good point, but also Moon has raised an interesting point as well, because it's asking the question of, like, with the systems we are designing, like, how do we not fall into these same traps? And like, you have perhaps these, as you say, two diametrically opposed, two diametric oppositions, and perhaps
you are going to account. It actually moves into a really important point. I gave Ramsey a second part of the notes to positive law, and I was kind of umming and ahhing whether we give that, but I will say I will package up the front end of positive law and get that through to Ramsey in the next week or so. But it is following on from the baseline, having a template to essentially filter and be able to discern what is functional law, what isn't law, what is a baseline of law, what is an unreasonable of law. The next thing that follows that is the ability to reason and argue. And so that's why I was happy to answer that question, because it actually folds into this. You are going to encounter, you already have in your communities, because it's a feature of communities, the concept of orthodoxy, whether you're conscious of it or not. All do. Ucadia had it huge amounts. It was one of the reasons I had to do a reset, because it made the ability to develop and evolve that much more difficult. All orthodoxy is an established acceptance of a certain status quo or certain norms under social consensus that then becomes if you like, the bedrock for further development. But in that process, things get concreted in, things get locked away. That's how we operate. It's not a bad thing. It's not a negative thing, but it's how we evolve. But what's the challenge is, in order to build, we're going to talk about bylaws now. So in order to build bylaws, probably the most important thing before you even start getting into the meat of what goes into a viable set of laws for a community to become a society, to become, in a digital world, essentially adapt to the sovereign characteristics, is those that come together have to have the ability to dialogue. And that's not an easy thing. If you think about it, we're not taught rhetoric at school. We're certainly not taught dialectics at school. We might have encountered critical thinking at school. We probably were frightened away from the Socratic method of questioning if we ever encountered it, or even if we knew it. We probably think an interrogation is the last thing you want to do, and it's probably related to being arrested. But the group needs to accept that in order to form a social consensus, which is what morality is, and all law is moral, so without a social consensus, there is no morality. Without morality for a group, there is no law. There will be no bylaws. There will be no viable bylaws. You need to keep in mind the ability to dialogue, which is what we're doing tonight. So,
Would you
Ramsey,
say
I think...
very quickly, Frank, just because you mentioned the Socratic process and something that might be more familiar to people, and if it's not, maybe we have discussed it in certain other groups, is the idea of steel man and straw man, which is a sort of more a pithy kind of way of describing kind of how to debate. And I just wondered, whether that's useful as well.
But look, I don't want to poo-poo people's evolution to getting there. My concern is the principles of dialogue and argument were honed and refined over centuries, millennia, in fact, of the human condition. And they're worthy of investigation before they're kind of put back into the cupboard. And my concern is people have never really been exposed to that, because they took that away precisely because those methods are so powerful, so effective, so useful. And I know that things can come back in and creep back in and be kind of repositioned and relabeled. But I really hope that as a group, people take the time to go back and see the classical methods of dialogue and monologue, the arguments, the methods that are used today, the upside, the downside, in order for you to try to course through to establish the most effective social consensus and collaboration. Because I really resonate with those values that are espoused within blockchain communities, and I hope and I do feel that people have some genuine feeling towards them. So that because of that, more than, say, other groups that may not share that type of view, there's a greater possibility that these skills that are classic, well-honed over centuries, find fertile ground, Richard. I really do.
Sounds like we need another a debating working group. Is which working group or channel are we using to post links? Just because I was googling the Socratic method, just because to remind myself of stuff. But where would
Decoding
be?
Law. The channel's called Decoding Law.
Oh, of course, yeah.
But
Yeah.
let's not like, and it's understandable we're going in a certain direction. But Moon did raise a question, and we do want to encourage any questions that you have that you feel are relevant.
Yep.
And
So I want to cap that off and then step in. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I want to cap that off and
okay.
yeah. I'll cap off that and then I'll get you ask the question. So, it's a valid question, and the way I'd answer it is this. And where I was going, I was kind of using a semi-Socratic method, if you want to know how I was approaching it, is to say that if two groups, wherever they may be, whatever community they may be, find themselves in opposing views and unwilling to find any level of consensus, not only can there be no dialogue, but there can be no synthesis, there can be no solution. And that's what I was saying at the end. And whether it be economic, whether it be geopolitical, whether it be, people, agendas, all those things play in. But at the end of the day, when two tribes go to war and there is no consensus, then war is the only process, and destruction is the only outcome in the short term. And that's what I fear we're facing in the American version at the moment. That's all. Yeah. So,
is there still a question?
Is there something to say there about the federal versus the state, and if that has some relevance? Does the federal just not want to impose a blanket law across all states?
No, look, it's again, it can be hair splitting, but the argument of what goes on and finding consent, like I said, morality is social consensus. If there's no social consensus, there's no morality, there's no law. That's the problem in America. There is no functioning law because there's no social consensus. And what happened is people handed this hot potato to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court looked at a document and out of thin air created an argument that simply doesn't exist in law. They created a fiction. In fact, the Declaration of Independence does state some pretty fundamentals: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. They could have argued an inverted argument and delivered a lasting precedent that wouldn't have been written down, but they didn't. They answered a negative, and there is no negative called abortion in the Constitution. There is an opposite, which is life. One could argue that women have rights of life, and even argue that unborn babies have certain rights, and find a middle ground. But the Supreme Court, in their, I wouldn't say their wisdom, 50 years ago, Roe versus Wade, didn't argue it in the positive, they argued it in the negative, which was the right of abortion. So the judgment of the Supreme Court, when it comes to law, is a valid one. The problem is they've thrown that out in an environment where there is no agreement, there is no social consensus, there is no morality, there is no functioning law. That's the problem, whether it be federal, state, or local. You're watching a society tearing itself apart, which is terrible, awful. Guys.
Hey, Frank.
Hey, hi.
Hey, I have a question. If it's still question time.
Sure.
First, and it's like two steps, but first I want to understand your perspective. Do you believe that democracy achieves consensus?
It can, and it can't view a mechanism. Viewing a mechanism and having a life of its own external to people is an absurdity. So no, democracy can, and the caveat is the people question. So it can achieve consensus. Yes.
You're saying it can. What if everyone utilizes it? You're saying that's the qualifier?
Well, the qualifier is, and again, why I took the question, and I might have seemed extraneous, but it's actually, let me alleviate anyone's concern on this call as to whether we're actually going to answer the question of bylaws. believe it or not, we're actually answering bylaws right now, because we are discussing the primary fact that bylaws of a community to be effective are achieved by consensus. Consensus requires not just the intention, but also the tool set to vigorously debate and discuss ideas and find a way of synthesizing those things. So again, my caveat is that across the planet and across the world for the last, I would say, at least the last 60 years, only a very small minority of people have ever been exposed to any of the classical methods of dialogue, and for everyone else, it's the nightly news. And to me, that is just it's deprived generations of people from being able to enrich the world and solve problems in their communities, because they don't know how to they don't know how to get to achieve social consensus. They don't know how to go about it.
Can I say one more
Okay.
thing, which I think is just... sorry, Wes, have you got another question?
Well, it leads into another one, but I'll wait. I'll wait until after you're done, because since
the
it
only-
triggers something. All right, I'll wait.
The only thing I was going to note is, again, if we take away from the abortion question, which is obviously a big hot topic in the world right now, but like in our own community, we had this exact thing occur between the founding team, who controlled a certain amount of the tokens, and a whale, a holder of tokens, who reached an impasse because they both took opposite views of a situation, and it created deadlock. And the only thing that unlocked the deadlock, I'm not saying it's all down to me, but the only thing that removed the deadlock in the end was the fact that there had to be mediation between the two groups. Now,
Right.
like, they didn't actually ever really see eye to eye, and you made the point, Frank, that if you don't have that, it ends up in war. Well, there's something interesting that happened with our community where it didn't really end up in war. It might have ended up in some some arguments, some words, like people being frustrated. But in the end, one side left, like they left governance and they moved to a different blockchain. Like, so it's kind of like, that's why I think it's useful to sort of come back to our own sort of community and just sort of show that this isn't sort of something that's abstract. This is absolutely, and ultimately the two groups, they didn't disagree on what to fund, they disagreed on how to fund, which is like a
Right.
very important thing.
And
Well,
if I can piggyback,
Good point.
Yeah.
and can I please piggyback off of that, please? Because it
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
thanks Rich, because that was the detail I was trying to process in my mind. So with that, just hear me out. Wouldn't that mean that despite Rich's ability to communicate, there are times where consensus is unattainable?
Yes.
Okay. And
Yeah.
And if then, because I feel that
Because
possibly,
let me
hold
qualify.
on, hold on.
Let me
No, I'll
qualify. I need
take
to
it.
qualify. Yeah.
Okay.
But no, I need to qualify why I said that. Consensus requires two or more parties to agree on terms. So whatever those terms are, it could be the thinnest veil of terms, just to agree to meet at noon, or just to have a phone on the desk, like the hotline, the red phones. It just requires that. There are times where one party, but more often than not two parties, position themselves with such entrenched interests that they can't find even the sliver of consensus. So yeah, there is times that consensus can't be reached, but fire on.
Yeah,
Keep going.
it wasn't a negative. Like, just
Yep.
I guess maybe since we don't know each other, I maybe
Yep.
need to reveal some things about like my personality. I don't believe in like context, sort of. It's a weird thing because it's ever changing. So I just
Sure.
ask questions and objectively just look at data points. So with that, for morality, I guess the point I'm trying to get at is maybe back to like Rich's question about the two different types of people, like why laws are changing. Because if morality is a consensus base, then it feels like it means it's ever changing. Like it in itself isn't
Well, parts
static.
of, parts of it are, but let's come back to a discussion we had a few weeks ago about decentralisation, and I use the analogy of decentralisation isn't just a mechanism like liquid democracy. The thing that really makes a community thrive is when rights can flow through that community like the blood cells in the veins of a body. Yeah.
Yes, believe me, we're eye to eye, but I'm listening.
Right.
We
And that is a dynamic system. That is a dynamic, literally a model of living. Yeah. To achieve that level of autonomy and I dare say even homeostasis, balance, which still involves ever changing, requires a deeper understanding of the mechanisms that go into building communities. But the first element in building the bylaws, and one of the first elements in building community, is the very tools we're talking about. The first one is what is law? And I don't know we've got there yet because I don't know if everyone has fully read or appreciated what that first 50 pages represent. It represents a filter, a cipher, a template, a framework in order for you, of your own accord, as I said, don't take anything I say as me trying to sell gospels or, home timeshare, whatever. You please, by all means, go and question and challenge and see opposing views of what I say. But those
or
first
if
50
you're up for a
pages,
challenge, okay.
yeah,
No,
yeah,
no, because if you're up for a challenge, it's
yeah,
different.
yeah,
Because I
yeah,
appreciate everything you've written, everything.
yeah,
To
yeah,
me, it reads like school. Like it's very informational. So
yeah.
I'm in a different position where I'm waiting for you to see a different point. Like because it seems like the best solution for the for like our current system. But if I understood what you said before, the current system lacks an inherent or has an inherent flaw, being that it lacks enough transparency. And because blockchain natively has transparency in it, it,
Well,
it means that
but
it means that there's a different opportunity to apply everything from like you know what I mean? You could actually apply what's written and it will work because you see what I'm getting at, right? So yeah,
I do, but
I'm
I
listening.
do, and I hope when you read what you read that you see that it's not. There's a paradox here, and I'll give you an example of that paradox. So one of the things I've built over decades is a system that, if implemented, would represent an autonomous financial system. And by that I mean a system that self-corrects, that self-heals, that manages, that doesn't actually require gods of banking or some elite class somewhere in the world making decisions on the life and death of people. That its autonomy brings all of that back down to grassroots community and back up again dynamically through a system that has its own intelligence. So in order to achieve high functioning systems, and that's what a society is when you really get down to it, is a high functioning systems, plural, more than one system interlaced. You need the ultimate goal. If you're talking about pure decentralization, there can be no greater benchmark to decentralization than intelligent autonomy. There can't be. Autonomy where a system doesn't require people telling you what to do is the ultimate freedom if it can achieve all the elements that are necessary in order for it to function and all the permutations that occur. If you think of all the different scenarios, from hurricanes to earthquakes to disasters to famines to riots, you name it, all those things happen and will happen in the future. So the paradox of what I'm saying when we talk about structure and we talk about rules and we talk kind of like school is that the output is the very thing you're talking about, which is, freedom and autonomy and transparency. But to get there, we're kind of back to Mr. Miyagi with the wax on, wax off stuff, right, on the fence, Karate Kid, that there are certain fundamental principles that if not accepted, even with the best of intentions, you won't get there. Or if you do get there, it's going to be an awful mess. And the bylaws are an output of the inputs that we've started to talk about. One, the baseline of what is and what isn't law, what's pretty fundamental. And the second is, how do we dialogue? How do we engage? How do we find common ground? And tonight, funnily enough, we've actually focused on the key things that get there. I still want to talk about the mechanics of what goes into bylaws, don't get me wrong. We'll do that before we'll do that in a moment. But if you don't have a strong set of principles and structures, there can be no effective decentralisation of a community. It can't be. How can it be?
No, I'm with you. That's why
Yeah.
that's why I like that you said that. And if you remember I think in our first discussion, you asked what's law. Like the perspective that I have is the reason why DAOs are called autonomous is that same reason. You need to be frictionless in order for it to operate. It has to, and so that's why I see laws as enabling, to be short, something that creates and facilitates. Like
Okay.
no
Well,
longer that way we can create a fictionlessness that's possible, the autonomy.
exactly.
'Cause-
All right. So I would say to everyone on this call and everyone who listens to this call that the next imperative, the first imperative is to absolutely embrace, hopefully, and read, and by all means question and challenge the opening section of Positive Law, which gives a baseline as to what is law, a civilised structure, and what is not law, because in that it gives you the first principles. It gives you the essential elements of what constitutes a civilised society. So if you start with that, then the next thing tonight is it is critical as a group that the skill set in being able to dialogue and understand that it's a process no different to coding, no different to building multimedia, no different to any learned skill. It is an acquired skill that a good portion of people who wish to be part of this need to learn and develop, and it is attainable. It's not a secret mystery, go on a journey. It can be obtainable, and the second section of Positive Law provides a really solid outline that I will get to Ramsey and I will get to the group for all of you to read. So that's the second part of getting towards minimum viable bylaws. Yeah. The third, so Ramsey, I want to check in with you. I know you've got a migraine. I want to see that we're on track with this. Are you okay so far?
Yep.
What we've covered? Cool. Okay. Richard,
yeah.
are you cool? Okay, good. So let's talk about the next thing. So there's some big decisions that need to be made, so that you're not doing things twice, 3 times, 5, 10, 15, 20 times. The easiest way. So what are bylaws and why are we thinking about them and what do they mean? So let's go back to the idea that we've spoken about of sovereign societies that have an identification of independence and self-control. So what do we mean by that? well, let's use the existing benchmarks that exist, and let's apply that into 3 different instances of digital communities that I've been working with and discussing with a number of you, discussed with Ramsey and discussed with and engaged with Richard on. And that is the concept of the Thou, the San, and the Sun. If you say it very quickly, it sounds like some profound Eastern mysticism. So, SAO, as a sovereign autonomous organisation, is a new and fresh look at the minimum elements that need to go into a digital entity that is beginning its journey in the blockchain community. And we replace that from a DAO by recognising that a SAO needs to have off-chain identity. It's fundamental to its on-chain existence. So in the off-chain world, there are entities called bodies, politic and corporate. I don't know if any of you heard that phrase before. You might have heard of body corporate before. Often strata structures of high-rise will talk of body corporate. You may not have heard of body politic, but body politic and corporate and what it means. So essentially what a body politic and body corporate structure means in an off-chain world is that a group of people have come together and defined their laws to such an extent that they are able to enforce their own laws and manage their own laws as one would expect a country does on a much bigger scale. So that's what body politic is. Body politic is the ability to define your laws in a formal way, to see that the community follows those laws in some effective way, that those laws are enforceable by the community in some way through some arbitration or some forum system. That's what body politic is. So in all 3 models, a SAO, a SAN, and a SUN is a recognition that the community must be able to define, manage, enforce its own laws. And that's a body politic. The body corporate is that it defines the relationship between an executive, a leadership, if you like, of a community and how it affects those necessary roles that occur, how it defines the rights of members and other people within that community, how it defines those in a formal way to essentially identify unique personality of that community, unique persons ultimately, and how it is able to see the rights flow through that community. So body politic and body corporate really go hand in hand, but in the off-chain world, that phrase is really an identity mark that distinguishes between whether an organisation truly has legal personality autonomy or whether it's claiming to be something and it's not structured. So can I get some feedback before we can continue? Is this...
Could you just phrase the body? I've just very quickly, Frank, in the Decoding Law channel, I've just defined, just so I want to check that I've got it right. So body politic is a community comes together to define their laws in a formal way, ensuring the community follows those laws in some way and enforcing them through some arbitration system or process. Is that about right?
Correct. Spot on.
Okay.
Great.
So,
terrific.
So body, and then a body corporate. What was
is the more traditional hierarchy that you see in a company, where a company is well formed in the way that it defines the management or the executive, if you like, the leadership, and the membership and the rights of those two. So in an off-the-shelf company, like in model articles, which you go to Companies House and you spend a few pounds and you get a model company, there's minimum there, right? There's absolute minimum. And they may not even define the rights. The difference with a body corporate to just a standard incorporated entity is that it clearly defines the rights of the members, the extent of those rights, and the authority of the leadership to represent the members. And you see that more often than not in a strata for the very reasons it would describe. When you're living on top of each other, those things clearly need to be defined. Yeah. So that's
Sorry,
a
did you
SAL.
say that last?
Yeah.
Sorry, that last bit again. So I'm just noting this. So body corporate is the more traditional hierarchy you would see in a company, well formed in the way it defines the leadership, which is the executive, the membership,
Yep.
and the rights of the members.
Correct.
Extended to an extension of those rights and the ability of the leadership to
Their authority.
have authority of the
Yeah.
members.
Yeah. Exactly. Which we are normally used to in the normal in normal society. We normally see that. Yeah, we see that. We elect them, we vote them, we kick them out. Yeah.
Yeah, which is the shareholders' agreement.
Exactly. We have but the key thing is a body corporate is not a body corporate if the rights of the members and the authority of the leadership are not well formed and not well defined. And that's why body corporates are most often seen in things like non-profit associations, sporting associations, and strata title, because by default, those applications of that really do have to get down to nitty-gritty of who has a right to a car spot, yeah? Who has a right to...
Did you say not credible? Did you say body corporate is not credible or recognised?
No. I'm saying... No, I didn't say that. I hope I didn't say that. Didn't think I said that. No, body corporate, we're used to seeing it in kind of older forms. So it's seen as an older world concept. We're used to seeing it in strata title of apartment blocks and non-profits and smaller. So it's not often understood. It's seen as an old way of forming a company, where the reason it's still used in that is take strata title. When you've got an apartment block, there are lots of conditions that come up. Who has the right to play music? Who has the right to have pets? Who has the right to the car spot? Who has the right to use the lift? Because of all those different requirements that need to be defined to achieve some living consensus, body corporate is what is formed, because those things are essential to be defined. Yeah?
Got it. So that's again, like, you see an apartment block as a community, not as a building.
Well, there you go. So there's a good frame of reference for you. Yeah? It's a kind of blockchain or block living.
And Frank, body politic, are all countries body politics?
That's an excellent question. That's a very good question. In theory, yes. And in practice, they are. They do. They have their own courts. They have their own rules. They have their own judges. They have their own structures, Supreme Courts, different levels of courts. So yes, a country is a body politic. Yep.
Cool. And so you mentioned a body corporate is an older form of way of structuring companies or structuring organizations of people. And are some corporations body corporates? Well,
actually, there's rarely do you see companies formed as both body politic and corporate. They're rare manifestations, and they do actually come with a warning if people just think that they're placeholders to slap on to your articles. They actually need to be substantively proven in the definition of the company, the definition of the society. But it's actually, body politic is much rarer and really only seen, I would say, in groups like church, like religious companies that are seen as corporation souls potentially, will have elements in there. You have ancient companies, or older companies like the East India Company was a body politic and corporate, which is worth going and seeing how they define themselves. They were done by statute, but still they had their articles. Body corporates are still common, but they're not. What I'm saying is that this knowledge is seen as kind of old compared to people getting into things like private trust companies and more, I'd say, exotic vehicles. Yeah.
Is the like, this is a leading question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is the BBC, because the BBC is instituted through statute, like it's licensed and it's a bit, and it's like, is that a body politic? Do you think?
Well, okay. The key is no. It probably not. If you see body politic in a statute, it will always be connected to a corporate. So it'd be body politic and corporate. The BBC would be a body corporate. Or it could be a corporation sole where the commissioner of the BBC has legal personality and everyone below them is an agent. You see that in the police. Police is an example of that, where essentially the commissioner of police or the attorney general is another example of a corporation sole. They are essentially both a title and a legal entity unto themselves, an office, and everyone else is essentially an agent of them, right? So I would imagine, I haven't read the statute for the BBC, but it was probably body corporate. Yeah, they're very rare to see body politic in corporate, but the clue is if the entity has its own tribunals and its own courts, chances are it could well be a body politic and corporate. But again, it's the reason I'm talking about this is I'm identifying for the group that there are fundamental structural components that go into making decision what you're doing before you even get to what the rules are. So we've covered the benchmarks, we've covered we can get together, we know how to dialogue. The next question is, what's the model we're adopting? And if it's a DAO, then you're not going to achieve your objective. If it's a SAO, which is Web3S and understanding these components off-chain and on-chain, then yes, you will achieve the minimum viable structure. If you're moving into what people call a meta-DAO type structure, then we call that a SAN, a sovereign autonomous, what do we call it? Network service? Yeah. So the difference between the two really is both there are nuances between the off-chain and the on-chain. So a meta-DAO in its design at that point should, by that stage, have achieved a substantive on-chain network structure. So we're talking about relay chains at a minimum type structure. Yeah. So if we're talking like Polkadot would be an example of a meta-DAO. Yeah. We're talking like a much broader structure. So the off-chain structure to make Polkadot essentially a SAN would be more than just simply incorporating a company. It requires at a minimum looking at structures around a trustee company. It looks at a minimum if it's got financial interest, which blockchains do. There's a minimum requirement of having at least some financial services company that can interface into their system, which is critical. There is the minimum requirement of having a media presence in the off-chain world to connect back on. And this is not because you're trying to veer into their system. It's just simply that when you reach that point and you're trying to manage essentially independent components, which is the rights of your members, the finances of your members, the problems of your members, If you don't have those off-chain structures, then you can't complete that process. You have to find people to do that for you. And if you're using third parties, and even if they're trusted parties, then you actually are not demonstrating that level of autonomy. And then, of course, a sun, a sovereign united or sovereign unified network is essentially the model of a digital society that has a digital verse where its infrastructure in the digital is reached a mature element, and it mirrors and supports the off-chain world of a traditional country. And a sun doesn't have to be a country, but most often not, it will be applied to some national structure. So a SAO, a SAN, and a sun, they're the primary prototypes that we've been working on to show a minimum viable functional structure to build then within that the bylaws, to have them encoded in to a degree of autonomy, and then to build the off-chain structures as well. Ramsey, did you want to comment, or Richard, on that before continue?
Sure. Yeah, that's well defined. Between a SAO, a SAN, and a SUN. You hear a lot about relay chains being defined as a sort of confederation of nations where each parachain is a nation. But in reality, it's probably that's not a great example. A relay chain is most likely, as you say, a sovereign autonomous network, which is a component of something greater, which would be a society, which would be a sun, and then a sun that's linking to other suns can then be a sort of federation or confederation or network or union or something of that sort.
Well, I think it's really important that the reason we went this way of trying to define this in a way of separating from a DAO to a SAO is not, the world doesn't need more acronyms. We're awash with acronyms. It was merely to find a way to describe the missing components that are fundamental to achieve the objective of what is a minimum viable sovereign community. So I come back to the SAO again, and we come back to building bylaws. We come back to creating the entity off-chain. The off-chain plays an incredibly important part of the formation and definition of the on-chain community, in that the rules, whether they be on-chain or off-chain, should be the same rules. There shouldn't be different rules. The rules that are established to form a body politic and corporate in the off-chain world should be the same rules that are equally able to be applied on the on-chain. They shouldn't be different, right? So,
sorry, Frank. Just pausing you there. Like the obviously the differentiator between the on-chain and the off-chain is, like, on-chain we're executing something very specific, whereas off-chain is more the social, the kind of like the messier, or commonly understood as the messier sort of part of the human sort of discussion and forum, right? It's the sort of ones and noughts on on-chain, and the color, like we said ones and noughts on on-chain, and it's a rainbow off-chain.
Yeah, look, I know what you're saying, and I don't disagree that there's a certain synthesis and chaos and dynamic element to the digital community and the flow, liquid democracy, and how things work. Absolutely. All I'm saying is that to be efficient in the building of your community, it's essential that you try and eliminate. You certainly don't want to be doing things that consume inordinate amounts of time, or that you have to do things twice. A community cannot function if it's got two sets of rules. There needs to be one set of rules. So whatever
absolutely.
Yeah. So whatever is defined in one needs to be reflective in the other. Now there may be some exclusions, and that's fine. There may be certain qualifications. There is, in fact, qualifications in the off-chain world of a domestic jurisdiction compared to the digital world. But we come back to Sal that the first principle is if you connect yourself to the wrong entities, then you've gone already down the wrong path, and there's no way to call that back but to come back and start again. That's the point I'm trying to make here. Yeah.
Can I ask one question related to that, which is just like as I understand it, and I'm not sort of too well versed, but like you obviously have case law where something happens that people go, wow, that's really bad, we can't have that happen again, and so there's a sort of retrospective, we need to make a law to stop this happening again. So we might have something in our community that might happen and people go, oh, we shouldn't do that again. But then there's also sort of and maybe this is just another facet of it, but there's kind of standards which we kind of proactively and anticipate something happening, maybe based on experience, but we kind of proactively create a process and a standard that maybe over time hardens into something akin to a law. Like, I guess I'm just interested in the sort of because it seems to me that laws like the kind of what Wes or Zovan was saying earlier is like there's a sort of emergence obviously about the way we work together, that certain things will come to the fore and require arbitration or require debate or require kind of arguing about in a way that sort of might not be predictable.
Well, that's okay. So now you're talking about the layering of your legal structure. So now you're getting into the meat of actually what you're assembling. Yeah. So, what are bylaws compared to a body politic in corporate? To answer that question, so a body politic in corporate as the off-chain identity both for a sovereign autonomous organisation and a SAN, which is essentially a meta-DAO, a sovereign meta-DAO. That structure has built in from the get-go in its articles the fundamental elements that make it operate. And then connected to it, it has the bylaws. And I want to make a distinction between the articles of association of that body politic in corporate and the bylaws of the body politic in corporate. So the articles, there are many different ways to design these. And I have designed and been part of designing charters and constitutional charters and different articles that one might say were overworded, but that was because they had an educative function. But equally, there is a way to approach the design of a body politic in corporate where the articles themselves just deal with the essential parameters of what that's supposed to do. And what are the articles of a body politic in corporate supposed to do? They're supposed to identify, number one, what is the community? Define what it is, its purpose, its function, at the highest level. That may be self-evident by its name, and some may define it purely at the level of name. That's fine. Better if they provide a bit more than that, as the Americans did with the Declaration of Independence. The next thing is to define the organs. I always used to have a funny thing about this word organs. It seemed old world and a bit occultish, but if you think about it, you're actually building a living being. a collective living being made up of all its parts, all its members. So the most important thing that articles of an association of body politic and corporate need to define for it to have any chance of being sovereign is to define effectively its organs. And by organs, I mean, what is its executive? How does leadership come together? Even if there's a process of electing, that's fine, but it still needs, you need to define something. A body has a head. It needs to be a head of some description. It could be council, it could be a temporary council, it could be one that's purely created as needed and dissolved. That's process. Don't confuse the two. Excuse me. Don't confuse the two, but there needs to be a definition of the executive. There needs to be a definition of the judiciary, that group that essentially oversees the law, that proves that the community can enforce its laws, that has the mechanism to do that. Then there needs to be the definition of the legislature, the group that forms law and discusses law, and that interposes itself potentially against other groups to find some way of consensus. And then there may be other organs that are critically important. You may want to define the verifiers. Yeah, you may want to define groups that are important to the community that reflect blockchain development. People that do.
What when you say verifiers? Sorry, Frank. What do you mean by verifiers?
That actually came out of my discussion with Ramsey. Sorry, I'm thinking back to proof of.
Like validators.
Provenance validators. I'm sorry. I had in my mind.
I thought it was a legal. I thought it was a kind of. I didn't realize it was a translation. Okay.
Yeah. So it's by defining the organs. And look, you don't need everything. You need to define the core organs of your community. That is the most essential component after identifying what your community is and what it stands for, what its purpose is to define its organs. And in defining that, you need to define the relationships of power at a minimum level, how power and rights transfer between those entities. Now, you can do it in a minimalistic way, as some have done. I would argue, as I said, I've done it in an educative way because I'm trying to introduce elements as it's done. But if I was doing it to a group, or I was part of a group, I would probably use a much tighter language and just deal with the minimum. And so the rights flow, how power moves between the head, the legislature, how it moves between the judiciary, these things need to be clear. And as you see in America at the moment, if they're not clear, then the base of future problems arise from those grey areas. Your articles do not have to define policy. They don't have to define, what's your policy on new members or new proposals or new funding. That's extraneous. In fact, those things belong in the bylaws. Yeah. Your articles do need to define members. They certainly do need to define the essential rights of your members. It does need to, your bylaws do need to define.
Sorry, Frank. Is this the next step? Is this the next step after define the organs, or are we still in defining the organs?
Yeah. So organs. So the key things of organs are, three key things of organs are: number one, that you define them, that they exist in your articles. Number two, that you define what they do, their purpose. And then three, you make some qualification that makes it easy to understand how that organ works with the other parts of the body. They're the three minimum requirements of defining an organ in your articles. Yeah? And then we move to members. You do need in your articles to define members at a minimum, how they come together, how they meet, how they participate within the organs of the community. That is an essential component of your structure. You don't need to get into policy, and that's what I was saying. You don't need to then add more around that. That is best suited for your bylaws, but your articles definitely need to get into how elections work and how that participates. You also need to talk about how the articles themselves are amended and what are the rules for amending those structures. So they're really the minimum requirements. If your body politic and corporate, your body politic and corporate shouldn't actually be a shareholder company. If it's a body politic and corporate, it's not incorporated by shares. It's incorporated by members' guarantee. So there is no shareholding in that. There will be funds within a community. There will be money, but that's an internal structure that is then used in more detail in the bylaws. But having said that, at the article level, it should be clear that the group has its own unit of account, its own currency, its own form of accounting, that it has the right for funds, it has the right to do that. So the last thing, but it's also a key thing, is the entity needs to define its own rights apart from all the internal rights. It needs to define, and that's usually done by what's called the objects. If you've ever seen a company articles, the objects that define essentially what the company is, which we just started at the beginning, but they also can be interpreted as powers of the company. And this is important because the general rule around the world is that a company can't adopt an action that is not permitted under its fundamental and corporate structure. It can't do that. So if you don't define it well, then you may find that you are limited by what you can and can't do. So that's a really high-level summary of the top level. Once you've chosen correctly the right model, you need to define your articles. And there are plenty of templates, as I'm sure Ramsey and others.
Can you just say the defining the objects again? It's the powers,
When you define the objects, you're defining essentially what the company does in more detail. But if they're done properly, they also happen to be the powers of the company. So well-formed objects are both the details of what the company can do, but also its powers. So does the company have? I'll give you an example. Does the company, and if it's a sow or a SAN, then the company needs to have, the body politic and corporate needs to have the power to have its own unit of account. It needs to have the power to manage its own accounts, to provide financial services to its own members. If that's not defined, then we have a problem, Houston. Yeah? That's what I meant.
And and always, obviously, this is within the jurisdiction of this entity, like not external. So the powers of the company, it's obviously that it couldn't just use those powers over anyone, or is that
no. It's limit. Well, it's limit. Let's talk about incorporation then, and what incorporation is. So Ucadia is unique in that Ucadia is able to incorporate Ucadia companies. Yeah. And so in the world, a company that is unincorporated has no legal personality. It has no rights to a whole property. It cannot own a bank account. It cannot do anything in their system. Now, there are plenty of unincorporated companies, especially up in Scotland, but the incorporation, so you can have a company that's incorporated in, if you wanted to build a proper sow you would incorporate within Ucadia. You don't have to, but that would be an optimum. If you do it through their system, a body politic and corporate will be formed by holding a convention between those members that choose to come together to form it. It will have a record of that, and when it goes to Companies House, it will form by a memorandum stating the fact that the company already exists and has already been formed. Now, it'll be incorporated, meaning that it will be within Companies House, it will be added to the Company House authority, but because of its prior existence, it's going to have a legal grey area there, meaning that if Companies House comes in and says all companies can't do their financial products unless they're licensed with the FCA, right? Let's say they did that, or did a ruling, came out. There's sufficient grey there to say, well, in fact, for our private members, we have the right as a private society to do that because it's in our articles. We're a body politic and corporate, and we absolutely give ourselves the right to do that to our members. So it does matter where you incorporate, clearly, but equally in their system, there is sufficient grey. It's grey that they created. Yeah? Does that answer, Richard?
Yeah, it does. I didn't manage to note all of that stuff. There's quite a lot to dig into there, but I guess this is a sort of yeah. I mean, this is probably one area I have the most questions and the most interested in, which is that kind of like the legal grey area or the interface between the existing Companies House and the kind of the social the society we would be setting up. But
yeah. So the thing is, incorporation. I come back to an unincorporated company in the world has no legal personality. It can't own a bank account, can't even apply for one. It can't own property, and it can't hire people. And essentially, it is an outcast. Yeah, that's what it means. When you incorporate in their system, you're essentially coming under the wing of a bigger company. So Companies House is, at one level, a company, yeah? And you're actually, by incorporating, you are being added into that fold. You're being brought into that fold. It's like joining a club, yeah? And in theory, the powers of your organisation cannot exceed the authority of the parent company. Yeah? You can't have more powers than the parent that you're under. Where that can be grey is, as I said, having formed a convention, having gone through and created the bylaws and the articles, and coming to Companies House with the fact that that's already done creates a grey area. That's one. Another is to incorporate in Ucadia and essentially create a foreign company registered in Companies House. And that's done by having an agent in the UK, so you form a standard off-the-shelf company, but then it operates as the agent for this foreign company. And then all your powers are essentially intact, and clearly there's that differentiation. Yeah. If you go and just, excuse me, just go, I'll have a drink.
Quick question on that foreign entity, Frank. If you can establish a foreign entity, is that analogous to an offshore company? Is that what we would normally understand? Or is it more varied than that?
The problem with offshore is it offshore implies a tax vehicle. It's like an SPV, a special purpose. So the problem with this, and again, I want to paraphrase this. Because I don't want to come across either as arrogant or sort of poo-pooing. We're talking about some really, really smart people, but the world has evolved now to kind of sexy vehicles. Yeah. So when you go to some of the best, brightest, and most successful, internationally renowned people for structuring, I'll say, no. Go here, buy that vehicle, and off you go. and they wouldn't understand any of the elements I've described in terms of sovereignty. And they say, what are you talking about? Don't do that. Just do this, do this, do this. It's fine. Because from their point of view, they're looking at what they know, what works, how the system runs, yada, yada, yada. They wouldn't conceive of these other things because they've never come up or it's not a problem. So there's a knowledge gap here, a huge knowledge gap that is problematic, where the community kind of outsources some of its own investigative work because you're going to get different soundings and different feedback, and that's going to create, it means that you could hear this and then still go off and essentially get an exotic vehicle that's an offshore structure that is far from sovereign. Yeah.
But is this again? I'm just leading maybe a little bit into the fact that this would be a useful exercise as an educator. You said earlier about how a lot of stuff you've done before, or the constitutional charters you've registered before, have been quite long because there's also been an educative element to it. And I'm just sort of trying to pick through the things you're saying and figure out like what might be something that we can use as an educative part. And for me, that certainly offshore companies are well known in crypto because most companies have either they've gone two routes. Well, there's three routes crypto companies have gone. They've gone either unregistered, so they've just gone with whatever their local jurisdiction is. They've gone with offshore, so Cayman Islands, etc., or they've gone to Switzerland. Like those are pretty much the three choices. Like, and so really, what we're talking about here is a fourth choice.
Sure. Well, let's talk about those other. Let's talk about some of the other choices. And I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago about the concept of sandboxes and how the system acquires knowledge, absorbs it, and then closes off the sandbox. And I use savings and loans as the example. Sorry to use the Matrix analogy again, but it was the old thing of Neo getting there and being the architect and being told that he's not the first Neo. That crypto's not the first sandbox by any stretch, or even conceived as a sandbox. So why am I saying this about this and entities? Herding entities into common pathways helps in the cleanup of a sandbox. If I want to be really brutal about it, so that's the harsh reality. Some might see that as conspiratorial, but just think of that one. And if you're seriously looking at being around longer than the next crash or the next change, then you need to see, as you pointed out, Richard, what is the fourth potential option? And just because people collectively, spontaneously, seemingly went one way, like a Wyoming trust or whatever, for wood ducks, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a long-term positive strategy. If blockchain communities are going to evolve into true digital communities with their own structures, off-chain and on-chain, and if those are going to actually represent truly a new sustainable version of sovereign digital and off-chain rights, then you can't keep following structures off-chain that give none of that, do none of that. Even if people say, well, that's how we do it, and that's back to orthodoxy again, isn't it? It's back to, well, that's what people told us to do, so we did it. I'm trying to break this down, and that's why I went through the elements the way we've gone, to show that the rationale I've described is embedded in the United States Constitution, many constitutions. Some are overworded. The European constitutions are overworded. But there are elements that go in, minimum elements that go into building a sovereign structure. And one of them is not building offshore structures in wood duck tax havens. There's no survival.
How is Switzerland? But how do you have anything? Just because I think it's relevant to the crypto stuff, because people know about it. But why is it that Zug has become like? What is it about their frameworks or their regulatory standing or jurisdiction has enabled them to to sort of be this sort of go between, or is that just the
No,
way
it's
that
it's not. It's perception. It's not. It's actually.
okay?
So I've actually read Swiss corporate law because I had a look the other day to answer this myself. So I'm glad you asked it. So 3 layers of tax in Switzerland. So the average tax is depending on the vehicles. It's actually not a particularly easy place to incorporate. If you want to incorporate what we would consider a public company in England, you have to front up a fair amount of cash in Switzerland to get an AG, their version of a public company, up on their books. It's a low tax environment, but when you add the federal tax to the local canton tax, that's their kind of local regional structure, and then you add there is often a city tax as well, you come up. You can come up with up to 14-15% as your tax, and they do have offsets. So it's not really. I don't know what the current tax rate is in the UK before offsets, but it's not exactly the lowest tax regime in the world. I think what Switzerland has going for it, particularly if you were building in blockchain and you're trying to utilize every mental concept of creating the right placeholder for your customers, Switzerland is a good one. And I think Switzerland had sort of lost its veneer there for a while. It used to be, famous, and then it went through all the regulatory alignments that it's gone through now. So it even aligns now. It's got its own trust law. Trust law came in this year. So it doesn't have any of those kind of secret offshore secret things it used to have. It's pretty much a full transparent environment. But I think Switzerland has still that allure of credibility, Richard. I think that is its shining thing. And for some people, it's not America. Yeah, I think that's it.
So it's more that they've sort of taken the opportunity to kind of market themselves as crypto friendly, and have then behind the
Absolutely.
scenes sort of which is sort of similar to Portugal's approach of having zero capital gains on crypto transactions, and I think Germany have done similar. Like Germany, I think Switzerland. There's no crypto to crypto tax on anything.
Yep.
I think in Germany, you only pay tax on the movement to fiat.
Yep.
So it's sort of like a regulatory competition, right, between different companies.
It is. It's huge money, and they've taken the opportunity to market themselves well. But there's nothing. What I'm saying is, intrinsically,
Yeah, nothing different.
there's nothing that really stands out against the others. I would say with a kind of, I hate ad hominems, but he looks slightly dishevelled and out of balance, with a commissioner of the SEC looking more like a medieval inquisitor. I think people are looking, if they haven't already, and say, well, America is not a good place to be based at the moment. And yeah, if Switzerland is offering that kind of crypto-friendly environment, then that's an edge.
But I guess the final point on this is there's presumably, because this is the way that like certainly Polkadot is structured. Like Web3 Foundation is based in Zug, it's based in Switzerland. Polkadot, I like all of the founders have Swiss entities. So there's also obviously the sense that I don't know whether it's there are legal protections there, but certainly there is a sense that rather than going and doing a Cayman Islands setup, there is a sort of maybe it's just optics, but there is a sort of certain amount of trust with that you're not going to get prosecuted in Switzerland. But there's no guarantee on any of this stuff, though, right? There's
No,
as
but
we've seen with Russia, like there's no reason to say that certain people couldn't have their crypto seized, even if it was held in or held by Swiss bank accounts.
no. Look, if someone has really got it out for you, and they happen to be in America, then they'll, as you see, they'll blow up a system. If they want to blow up a system, they'll destroy their own SWIFT system if they think it achieves a goal. I do like the maturity of adopting a jurisdiction, whether it be Switzerland or Britain or Singapore or, for that matter, Delaware, that has a well-formed law, and that by doing the structuring properly and behaving maturely, you minimise the footprint for controversy to as close to zero as possible. Nothing is guaranteed, as you point out. There's a lot to be said, though, to behaving as good corporate citizens. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing weak about that. Your strength is in your community. That's the on-chain world that you should be dominating. The off-chain world is there to support you. And I see nothing wrong with Switzerland other than the fact that it's there's nothing special about the financial position. But I agree. I think Switzerland has made a point of doing that, and that shows the Swiss's intention. Singapore in the past has done similar things to build its financial world. I think it's a great place to establish, and I'm sure with different Swiss entities, whether it be the private Swiss trust, or if you get sufficient structure to even structure an AG, essentially a public structure there, that everything we talk about could work perfectly in Switzerland. Not a problem.
Since you mentioned it there, is there anything that's worth noting defining a company that's a private company or a listed company, certainly within the UK jurisdiction?
Look, there are lots and lots of things, and I think the thing about the UK as opposed to Switzerland is that the UK has a mixed history with its agencies that tend to be at war with one another. There tends to be waves where the regulatory environment can swing between extremes, as you know, and they can be in favour one day and against you the next, which makes it very difficult if you're in a innovative space, and certainly a carving space. It's why companies have left. Dyson, for example, the brilliant inventor that left the UK in controversy, basically saying you can't do this in the UK, went to Singapore, I think. Did you go to Singapore? I can't remember. Left anyway.
Yeah, it was Singapore, yeah.
Yeah, and he's coming back, I think. So it's swinging. But to me, that's a good test case example of the ups and downs of the regulatory environment in the UK if you've got a public presence. Yeah, if you're entirely private, well, the UK is fine for you for that. But if you have any touch points that you step into the public, which is what we still talk about, the only problem I see, but it's huge, is that the UK seems to be blowing where the wind's blowing, and it can be good today and it can be awful tomorrow. Switzerland seems to take a longer view on this, to be less knee-jerk, and therefore it makes decision-making easier. Singapore, similar. They tend to be a little bit more strategic in their agencies, whereas in the UK you can have one group telling you one thing, another telling you another, and it's a nightmare. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so your final thing, we were going back to the bylaws, but the thing you've established there is that we could do this in a kind of, whether it's a UK or a Delaware entity, and we can define the body corporate and body politic. But you also talked about Ucadia being able to be a company, and Companies House being a company that effectively governs other companies. Like with
Correct.
Ucadia being something that is Ucadia itself, your aim is that, or the established system is to be able to establish companies under
we do it now.
Ucadia.
Well, we do that now. So
the question is there a middle ground? I guess the question is, there's Ucadia with your ability to do your own companies under Ucadia. There's Companies House with it being the supra organization that issues the rights and, as you say, has the ultimate power over those underlying sub companies. Like, is there a sort of, what does the entity look like that bridges those two things? Like, is that like just
okay.
yeah?
So what you can do, so it's really a question of what you want to do on the other side of the bridge. Yeah. So if I'm a sow, if I'm starting out this journey, I might, and these are horses for courses. Depends on how you want to develop this. You could, in theory, incorporate your entity within Ucadia and therefore be entirely recognised as sovereign. Yeah. And then roll that through to being a foreign company registered to an agent in the UK. So essentially the doorway you go through in the UK is through the agent. But your identity
Who are
and
those agents? Who are those agents? Sorry.
well, you can either create one yourself on the ground with some people who are trusted and they need to be trusted. So essentially they're trustees, if you want a different word. Or you can go and find someone who will act as your agent, and there are companies that do that for you. A modification of service companies, yeah? So you can do that. You can go and do that tomorrow. And what they would do is that would essentially create a doorway, a company onshore in the jurisdiction of England and Wales. But the parent entity, incorporated in Ucadia, is a foreign entity, right? It's a body politic and corporate. It's a sovereign corporation, and it has all those rights. And there wouldn't be any grey in that sense to what it is. Or you can use the natural grey that exists in the way the law works. Make sure that you run a convention, agree on the articles, agree on the bylaws. By the way, the bylaws goes back to your original question of policy. You know, the dynamic changing rule set that exists within the community are in the bylaws, not in the articles. The articles sit above. That's kind of like the infrastructure. The bylaws is the fit out of the society. It's the furniture, it's the dressings, it's the drapes, it's the decor. Okay, but the articles are the walls, the foundations, the piping, the wiring. Yeah. Then you can go for grey and incorporate through Companies House and still have a perfectly viable entity. Or you can go a bit exotic and do it through Jersey, and Jersey's got great structures, and do it that way. Or you can do it in Switzerland.
Sorry, Frank. So agree on the articles, which are the walls. Agree on the bylaws, which is the furniture. Agree, and then the next step is, do you agree a convention?
No, the convention. The idea is a convention is essentially the formal coming together of members to define these documents, and by recording the proceedings, you prove, like any country, like the founders of the United States, that you have formed an entity. The rituals are no different, even though they're at different scales. The rituals are no different. What people miss in the modern world is they say, I don't have time for that, just get on with it, off we go. But what the digital community you're part of, what blockchain communities have acquired, is an appreciation of consensus, appreciation of collaboration. And by bringing that freshness back, don't underestimate the importance of the process. The process of forming a company says as much to what the company is as to, what's written down or where it's incorporated. Truly, we're splitting hairs whether it's formed in Switzerland, as long as it's a credible, stable legal framework that's not going to, gyrate between extremes, which is still a risk, unfortunately, in England, less if you do it in Jersey. As long as you're not in any danger that things are all going to blow up tomorrow, the elements really work in a whole range of different places. So
I agree.
Huh?
That bit's absolutely clear now. But the bit that I think is the really interesting piece that you were just saying there, but it almost relates back to what Wes or Zavan was asking earlier. Is so you have the articles, the bylaws, and then you create a convention and record the proceedings. And so effectively, this in itself is the kind of like we could, like, a group of people could just sit down and say, here are articles, here are our bylaws. But ultimately, it's the fact that those bylaws are being enacted, used, and certain things are being executed. That's the proof that you have a real community.
Always,
So that's
always. And you already have a community. Yeah.
Yeah. This is the piece which is kind of the, if we assume, which is true, that this thing is always emerging, always changing, always evolving, that it's the emergence that is the proof. As long as you record it, as long as that is emerging in line with the bylaws and the articles, which are itself kind of codependent. But that's what I get now. The convention is essentially like there's sort of legal proof by the very fact of its existence through that it's evolving in these, using these terms and these rules that proves it's a real society.
It does, and look, it may because it's rarefied knowledge, maybe outside the general knowledge of even some very good solicitors. It's certainly within the realm of knowledge within still within the lead of government and within the higher ups of courts and structures, that this is the essence of what creates societies. I've got checklists. Look, it's not my first rodeo doing this. I've done this a few times. So there are steps that can be shown, and it is paint the dots. But the point of, no pun intended, the thing tonight is really to come back to those first principles and to approach this as first principles. One, not to be overwhelmed by all the pieces that come your way, but also the other side, not to be too glib or too sheen about it. Of yeah, we'll do that. I've got a list of things to do. We'll get round to that. It's that middle ground of saying, look, we now clearly understand what is and what isn't, so we can determine that ourselves. That's one of the most powerful things a group can ever have, is discernment of law. When a group can have a way of discerning what is and what isn't, then they have really achieved a power that even many established countries have lost. When you then add to that the ability to dialogue, we already know that that's lost. We know that's lost in the United States at the moment. When you add to that the checklist of going through the processes and the passion that's here, this should be a straight up doable, achievable objective. And if you want help, I'm here to help. I mean, mindful of time, still beavering away on Ucadia things, but absolutely, that's why I'm here to engage, because I feel that there are unique qualities that you guys are doing that are pioneering, and I know you get these things. Okay,
that's a lot clearer for me, certainly. I feel like the pieces, I had like a jigsaw piece with maybe the corners. I can see the sort of picture now. And I've just noted this down because I'm writing. Sorry, I keep stopping you, but I'm taking notes and sort of sharing them in this channel. I don't know if you can see whilst we're going through. But the Option 2, which are schools, the walls, agree on bylaws, the furniture, then create a convention and record the proceedings. Then you can prove it as a real society, which allows you to register at Companies House. But that's still the legal grey area.
Yeah, but again, not to be. The thing about a society, and I give a difference here that I know you have that a lot of people don't have. And I'm getting back, by the way, the Law Explained series that used to do on Ucadia is coming back online. It'll be part of Around Positive Law. So there's going to be a lot of material I can refer you to that helps give a few more of those pieces that might be missing. But I think something's really, again, a really first principle point to what we're saying is this. Being sovereign and being independent and being a community is the fact that you are, not because you say you are. Right? Because you live by that, because you act accordingly, not because you've written it on some website or can flick out an ID and say, you can't do this to me, don't you know who I am? And one of the great...
Don't tell me you're funny. Don't tell me you're funny, tell me a joke. I always liked.
Right. So we are in a community, examples on the internet, and certainly I've been involved in this, where no matter how hard I've tried to explain that, people have defaulted to what in many respects is easier, which is to shout that I'm independent and claim that I'm this, but not act accordingly. There's no substitute to that. And that's why the laws defined, the laws maintained, and the laws enforced in a decentralised, autonomous way is essential to demonstrating a true living independent community, as opposed to all the claims in the world. So don't worry about the grey as much. It is splitting hairs, and it should be seen as that. The real power is in the embracing of this knowledge and the immersing of this knowledge in the community as your knowledge. Everything I share, once it's shared, it has a life of its own. What you acquire is your own unique perspective, what you've already done. And yeah, don't worry about the nitty-gritty. With members and private societies, incorporated, body politic and corporate, able to maintain its own laws, what you do for your members is a totally different perspective to what you do in the public. And there's a lot to be said about being, when I say it sounds like it's a funny thing, but when you say private society, that's precisely what it is. The Masons are a private society. Lots of groups are private societies. The original savings and banks and so on were friendly societies. They were private societies to start with. So all these things have strengths. It's the public area, it gets harder. The public area, you've got to register, you've got to work with agencies like the FCA, and you've got to deal more and more with the HMRC and others in the UK. But you already got more than three quarters of it right. You're already a living community with views and opinions. It's just the final touches on that and evolving in the right way. That's all.
That's pretty.
Hey,
That's pretty.
and thanks for the great words too. I have one detail, and maybe
Yep.
are you still on for? Okay. And Ramsey did tell me I should just. So FYI, we've been recording or working on recording our rights for our contributors. It's been something that's been ongoing for about the last 3-4 months. We've had hashing calls on our community where everyone provides feedback. So just to maybe just provide again some details that we are actively a lot of what you're wanting, it's happening now. So it's also why I'm asking such direct questions so that I can because we're doing it. So going back to your structure in blockchain, or at least for us, democracy handles award distribution and chain modifications. So as far as like enforcement to law, that is what the community is enacting.
Mhm.
With that, we also have a flat hierarchy, but like completely. So
Mhm.
structurally, because we're trying to sort out, like, because we have contributors and citizens. That's probably the only delineation between the two, really. And so we wanted to create, or thinking about creating some type of structure for like auditing, so we can reward, so you can really highlight, not in a bad way. Everything is proactive, uh, but it's a really just a question to you. What structures would be needed? What's beneficial to make that work?
Well, I think it's a pretty broad question, and I think the important thing, and I'll refer back to something we said earlier about, what if we had an Indigenous tribe come on tonight? And in fact, if I use my answer to that here, the best answer is to understand what the group wants to achieve, and then meet that objective, rather than coming in and saying, no, you're doing it all wrong. You do it this way. If there's one thing that's come out tonight, I hope is loud and clear, is that without passion, without commitment, without wanting to be a community, without living in a community, you've got nothing. You have nothing. So you've got 3/4 of it already. You've got most of it already. So I would say, if you've been doing this over a period of time, do small steps. There are refinements. Yeah. If there's a rush to need things done, you get them done. But I think the group has already established, look, every community has its own identity, whether it be a sport or an interest. And when communities start to lose sight of their purpose for being, that's where they start to fall apart and people leave. Yeah? People give up. So you've already started that. It's just a matter of refining that and how that's applied, and how it can be, how your vision can be strengthened, right? That's all it is. So I'm not trying to avoid answering, but without kind of sitting down and going through that, my answer is not going to get anywhere close to what it should be. And I think it's respecting every community has its own personality, its own desires, and by that, its own limits. That's not a bad thing. It's just who we are. It's why we belong to different groups. If every
Then
group was the same, right? If every group was the same, it'd be boring. So we belong to different groups because one group does this and one group does that. We kind of get a bit frustrated when groups start flipping out and doing all these different things, right? So I hope I did give you a clear enough answer, but I think it's a question of what's driving your group that can only truly answer that question, right?
yes, and I think that's a great answer. Thank you. You answered completely. I very much appreciate it.
All
Only
right,
detail
cool.
is that I think it creates a trap card. So because what I take that is it means it will continue to be active, and I see you already as part of our DAO. So then it means I will ask you to remain and stick around. Just a heads up.
Oh, well, if you want me to stick around, I have a window of time. My time is, that's why I committed to this, because I feel, because of the response, because of the feedback. And, I'm happy to do a few more of these. I don't know how many more beyond a few more I can do in this Q&A. I've got other materials coming on that'll come through the Law Explained series. But as both Richard and Ramsey will say to you, I'm more than happy to tee up when we've got collective time to have chats, and I want to collaborate. There are things that you do that will help Ucadia, and there's things that Ucadia does that helps you. It's mutual, and there are lots and lots of people around the world that are familiar with Ucadia and want to see the development of what we've done come back, and this is helping. So it's all part of it. So yeah, one way or another, in all of that, the answer is yes. Yeah, we'll
Yeah,
find a way. Okay,
great to
all right.
hear.
Okay,
Great to hear. And I'm encouraged
good,
for everything that's happening for Ucadia. Seriously.
good, good.
Good.
I'm going to Well, I'm going to wrap up there and reach back to you, Ramsey. Are you okay with this being I think we've kind of got through a fair bit tonight. Are you happy to wrap it up here?
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks for everyone's contribution there. That was really productive. Shall we do same time next week?
Look, if people want, I can do next week. I think from next week onwards, I'll have to look and see time-wise. But only look, I'd like to explore further the material that you want to see. I certainly talk to you, Ramsey, about the next set of notes to help people, certainly on dialogue and different ways of engagement. But yes, I can do next week. Yep.
Awesome.
Could we use next week? Sorry, Ramsey. Could we use next week? I don't know whether it's worth as a practical, almost like homework. Like if we just sort of start with some of those components and sort of actually use Edgeware as a sort of start filling in the blanks, so to speak. I know the Bill of Rights thing has already started with Wes. So I don't know whether that would be useful for next time, or is there a specific talk for next week?
No. Look, I've kept this fluid, Richard, for that very reason. My only request is the material, and I'm sorry I throw over these large chunky documents, but they really are essential components, and certainly that first one is an essential component of understanding baseline. I would love it if people can achieve a minimum response and a minimum element in between the calls. That would make it much more focused towards objectives. That would be wonderful, but that's up to you guys. If you want to do that, I'm all for helping and give some more material to you to look at. We talk about checklists or how conventions run, or the essential elements of articles, and break that into a framework. And I promise you, less than 50 pages. A few pages. That's up to you. You tell me, but I'll keep it open. Ramsey will tell you, I've been keeping the agendas entirely in his hands and your hands as to what you want to hear. I'm not driving this. You are. Yeah?
Thank you. Yeah, and I feel like we've come a long way since the beginning of this call in understanding a little bit more how to achieve minimum viable sovereignty as a community, and hopefully we can develop that further and put perhaps something into action.
I have to say the biggest piece for me, which is something that I've maybe been aware of but maybe have not put my finger on, is the dialogue piece, Frank, that you talked about. That was kind of hit on with the abortion thing, and obviously the different contentious issues we've had in the community. It's not just about the standards, it's about how we debate and how we talk to each other and how we create dialogue in between each other, in between the different elements, and document that as we go. So that was useful as well.
Good. All right, guys. Thank you. And I'll give you a quick call in a few minutes, Ramsey, to wrap up. But guys, thank you so much. And we'll talk to you next week. Okay?
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Frank.
That's great.
Have a
See you. Okay, bye.